Diego Pavia, the grad transfer. Johnny Manziel, one of our viewers called him the Mexican Manziel.
Mexican, yeah, new Mexican Manziel.
New
Yeah.
New Mexican Manziel.
Yeah. Though I think he might be Mexican through ancestry. Yeah, I think that might be right.
Yeah, but just great job on this story. Tell us what stood out. I love the imagery of him coming out of high school because it sounded like he wanted New Mexico to give him a scholarship offer, and they thought he was arrogant.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the way I've described this and his you try to get to learn as much about these guys as you can in about 2 or 3 days of doing research, right? So I'm gonna stop short of saying I'm an expert on him, but you did get a feel from talking to people that in many ways what his strength is as a player, which is confidence, bravado, man, sort of toughness, fearlessness, in many ways, in some ways was working against him in the recruiting process. He's a kid who has an edge. His high school coach, even his brothers, they talk about like, hey, like we in this family, we have a little bit of an edge, right? He was a wrestler. Frankly, he's built more like a wrestler than a quarterback. And his physical limitations, I think, limited him out of high school. He didn't have any FBS offers. But I also think, again, to a certain degree, that bravado, that toughness, that edge, I think even his high school coach said, like, turned some folks off. But when you get him from everybody who's coached him and had him, when you say, no, I'll take a chance on this guy, the teams that have taken a chance on him, whether it's his junior college, whether it's New Mexico State, whether it's Vanderbilt, have all realized, oh no, once you get him in the building, that confidence becomes contagious. That edge is a good thing. That edge is the thing that, one of the things that got left on the cutting room floor of that story was Barton Simmons, who used to work for 247, but is now sort of the GM at Vanderbilt under Clark Lee, saying like, we needed that edge. We needed his personality because that's what we were lacking in our culture, is this like, hey man, we can play with everybody. Hey, I am the best player on the field, even though we're playing Alabama. So it's interesting how his rise has been, again, a little bit of like what held him back was some of that personality, some of that edge, but it's also been his superpower to a certain degree.
Yeah, Ralph, when the dude came out and said, his idol was Johnny Manziel growing up, that basically said everything about him. Just talk about how in this 1 year playing big time edge, his confidence and bravado, but he also plays really good quarterback and plays the game in a way it's free. You can tell he's not thinking much. It's just a lot like backyard sandlot football, and that's what makes him so dangerous. Talk about that and what he brings to Clark Lee's team.
Yeah, and they built an offense around him, and understand, like, he's not the only New Mexico State import, right? He was at New Mexico State, and they turned the program around there. I mean, that's a program that, when it comes to like the bottom of FBS, that's where New Mexico State usually lies. And in 2 years there, they went to 2 bowl games and won 10 games. But it was Jerry Kill, who's coached a lot of places in FBS, and Tim Beck is the offensive coordinator. Clark Lee went to hire Tim Beck as the offensive coordinator and basically said, we'll just take the whole package, right? We'll take the quarterback, we'll take a bunch of the players, and hey, Jerry Kill, come to my staff and be a consultant, like an advisor. The offense that they built around Pavia is, has a sort of a freewheeling spirit to it, right? I've heard people who are a little more X's and O's inclined say it's essentially kind of an option offense, right? Not triple option as we see the academies, but a lot of RPOs, a lot of like, we are attaching this to that, and we are going to sort of let Diego cook here. And maybe that means running. Maybe that means, that we see a lot of this play, right, in these day and age. Like, quarterback runs 2 or 3 steps and still has a receiver out to the side where he can flip it behind or flip it ahead for a pass. So I think that they built an offense conducive to his style. not asked him to do too much not asked him to do some things that maybe he'd be uncomfortable doing, regular old drop back where he has to fire darts 30 yards across the field, but taking advantage of his strength, which is toughness, the ability to run, and again, to sort of be quick thinking and not flustered, right? When you're asking your quarterback to make those decisions, what you need is somebody who's not going to be flustered.
So I love that. I think it was Kill and Beck are watching the JUCO National Championship between Pavia's New Mexico Military Institute and Iowa Western, and they were recruiting the Iowa Western quarterback, watching that game, and looked at each other and said, we're recruiting the wrong guy. Yeah.
And of course, because, they're football guys, they're doing that scouting from a Hooters, right, in New Mexico, right? Because that's the budgets that you have when you're in New Mexico State, right? You're going to do a lot of your scouting off the television. And as Tim Beck said, hey, I've known that coach at Iowa Western for a really long time. It was not the easiest conversation to call him up the next day and say, hey, we're changed our mind, but nonetheless, we got to change our mind. And again, that sort of speaks to this idea that this kid, very few points in his life where everybody has been all in on him. He's always been the guy who is one or two people decide, I'll take a shot on that. Right. Even the JUCOs weren't necessarily, they decide, okay, we'll take a shot on that. And it's worked out in New York because I don't think he had a ton. Now, listen, when you're offensive coordinator and you're head coach and he's very close to Kill and he's very close to Beck, go to Vanderbilt, it's likely that you're going to obviously in today's day and age follow those guys. Right. But I don't think there was a huge line outside the football building in Las Cruces, trying to get Diego Pavia to Power 5 teams. So I just, again, it sort of speaks to this idea, there's not that many people who seem to believe in this kid, but the ones who do all hit it big. They all hit the jackpot with him.
Well, and Clark Lee's watching Pavia carve up Auburn last year and then decides, I'm going to Las Cruces because maybe that's the offense I need. So kudos to Clark Lee for changing everything.
Yeah, and we were both at SEC Media Days, and I think what stood out to me about with Lee, and I think it's one of those things where you hear coaches say a lot of things at Media Days, and you're like, we'll see, right? We'll see how that translates when it comes to ball being played. But it resonates now retrospectively. He talked about how he entered the job at Vanderbilt as a former Vanderbilt grad, really right before portal NIL exploded, and sort of had this mindset of what he wanted the culture and what he wanted Vanderbilt to be, and realized that, that doesn't work anymore because I can't develop players for 3 or 4 years because as soon as I get one good, he's jumping in the portal and he's going to end up at an SEC rival, right? And it was a mind shift that what he remember him saying was, at this point, everything we do in our program is to win a football game. Now, I know you say, shouldn't that be the case? But, again, it's Vanderbilt, right? Culture, bringing in kids, life lessons. We hear a lot about that from college football coaches. And I think for a guy like Lee, it was a matter of no. Everything we do has to be about winning football. Every single detail within our program is now about winning football games. We're still going to try to build the culture. We still need to have the right guys in here. We can't afford to take knuckleheads who are going to miss because that screws things up too. But it's all about where are we going to find wins here at a place where it's hard to find that. And again, I think that you bring in a guy like Pavia and you go raid New Mexico State with the idea that hey man, this is a winning culture here. We need to bring this to Vanderbilt. It's odd to say that there's a winning culture in New Mexico State, but That's what they had built there. And we need to bring that to Vanderbilt. And again, that shift in ideology, that shift in philosophy, you can now see it now on the field. It sounds like coach speak at media days, but you see it now with Vanderbilt because they're winning games.
Yeah, Ralph, talk about just the JUCO route, because a lot of coaches, they look at junior college and you look at some of the players and be like, okay, why is this player here? Is he going to be a cancer to the locker room? I mean, it's very hard to find a Cam Newton situation where Cam played that 1 year at Bland and he goes on to Auburn, wins the Heisman and the national championship, becomes the #1 overall pick. But I think guys like Pavia are changing that narrative a little bit more, especially on the Power 4 level. Talk about just that approach that some of these maybe not blue buds should go about it, kind of like what you were saying, just go and get some of those guys that have been forgot about.
Well, listen, I mean, I think a lot of us like remember the Last Chance U, right? And you know, I lived in Mississippi and covered college football down there in the early 2000s. So when you live in Mississippi, there's great JUCO there, but you know, even the JUCO coaches will tell you nobody really wants to be here. None of all the players, they understand that this might be a step towards something else, but none of them very few of them come to us because it's their first choice. So just you kind of gives you a framework of what you're dealing with a lot of times at JUCOs. You're looking at kids maybe again like a Pavia, who I don't have a lot of opportunities. Maybe I need to clean up my image, whether that's fair or not. But maybe somebody sees me as like a little not quite as physically gifted as I need to be, or maybe I got something off the field or something in my personality that I needs to shift here a little bit. And I think he was one of those kids that had a couple of those different elements where the JUCO was a place for him to sort of thrive, to let his personality shine, which was, again, a big personality. You know, even his JUCO coaches started talking about him like showing up looking like, you know, Paulie D from the Jersey Shore with like chains and earrings and like and blonde tips in his hair. And like the JUCO coach is like, man, what have I gotten myself into here? But again, he gets in the door. He starts working hard. He starts ingratiating himself. He's not a kid. He's confident, but he's not arrogant to the point where he's putting other guys at arm's length, right? He's bringing people sort of towards him. He's a magnet. He's charismatic. And, you know, listen, does that open the door to all the JUCOs? I don't know. It's a tough time for JUCOs, right? The portal creates different dynamics. But I do think that, like, you do have to sort of keep an open mind. I would say this, the story of Diego Pavia is, you know, so to use a cliche, don't judge a book by its cover, right? I think that my sense is he's a kid who got maybe sort of pigeonholed as one thing, but when you got to know him, became another thing. And, you know, that doesn't make him a perfect player or a perfect person, but I know the kid's a winner. And because I know that because I just look at his resume. State championship, played for a state championship in high school, played for a national championship in JUCO, went to 2 bowl games at an FBS outpost that never goes to bowl games, and now all of a sudden Vandy is good. I mean, like, there's no denying that this is not a coincidence that this follows this kid around.
Talking to Ralph Russo, national college football writer for The Athletic. And Ralph, I thought it was very interesting in your story. You talk about how Pavia gets to New Mexico State and he's competing with Stowers. Eli
Stowers, yeah, who's a Texas A&M recruit a few years back.
Yeah, and they didn't like each other. And now Stowers is at Vanderbilt with Pavia and their roommates.
Yeah, so what Tim Beck sort of described it as, it was just a water and oil relationship. Like Pavia, this big personality, and Stowers, you know, far more even keeled, very reserved. Like Pavia has become a lot more religious. He's really connected with his faith, but Stowers was sort of always there, right? He was always very, you know, passionate about his faith, very religious kid. And again, there was a little bit of an oil and water situation there, especially when they're competing against each other. Pavia wins the job. They go to Stowers and sort of say, hey, you know, you're a pretty athletic kid. this kid was like a 4.5 star kind of quarterback coming out of high school, going to Texas A&M. Big kid, like, do you mind changing positions? He does. That goes pretty well for Eli. And now at Vanderbilt, right, Eli and Diego are roommates. I think Diego is still a kid who likes to sort of burn the candle at both ends a little bit. But as I mentioned in the story, the day after the Vanderbilt, Alabama upset, it's Sunday. Diego's got all of his, like, a lot of family members come to his game. Family and friends, they usually get about 100, family members and friends coming to his game. They're a wild crew. The brothers were out there tearing down the goalpost and riding the goalpost down Broadway. So the next day, Diego wants to spend more time with his family who's still in town. And he gets a text from Eli asking, hey, Diego, did you go to church today? And Diego's like, oh, man, I really needed to spend some time with my family. They're leaving soon. I promise I'll get back to it next week, man. But so that's their relationship, right? Their relationship has evolved from, like, again, this sort of yin and yang. Are they, or this oil and water situation, salt and pepper? Do they really sort of mesh here? To, in some ways, it sounds to me, and again, like, I don't want to delve like I'm an expert, like too much of an expert here, but it does seem like Eli is the angel on Diego's shoulder a little bit.
Yeah. Well, before I know you got to bounce, but what did what's your impression of Texas, so far this season, and kind of what you thought of that game against Georgia?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate too much, especially in today's day and age with the 12-team playoff. I think we've, you and I, Chip, we kind of, Zay, you're a young guy, but you and I, we grew up with this idea that, like, these teams will play once. That will be it. The result is the defining statement between these two teams. And now, we were seeing rematches more and more with conference title games and the college football playoff and four-team iteration. But I think now you really have to be open-minded to the ideas. Like, we may see these two teams again, and just because one team beat another doesn't mean that that's the last word on that relationship between those two teams. So I say all that to say, not particularly worried about Texas going forward. They still look like a team that could win a national championship athletically. The weapons are still there. I think the thing that stood out to me about the difference between Texas and Georgia, and I think it's the difference between Georgia at its best and everybody else in the country. Nobody plays more violently than Georgia. And I mean that as a compliment. I don't mean dirty. It's a violent football. Football is a violent game. Nobody plays more violently, more physically than Georgia. And that is the trademark of Kirby Smart's teams. You may have the same level of athlete, but do you play with the same level of intensity? When you watch guys like Jalen Walker and Mikael Williams, as good as they are, as talented as they are, they play with a fierceness and a violence that is hard to replicate. So maybe the lesson that comes out of that game from Texas is not so much, we need to make this X's and O's adjustment, or we need to do this or then this tweak or that tweak. It's, we need to learn to play like that. Yeah. Right. And I think Texas has come a long way in their physicality, what they look like on the lines. And that mindset has come a long, long way under Steve Sarkisian. And I'll also credit the guy I went to high school with, Kyle Flood, the offensive line coach, for changing some of that mentality too. He's done a great job of building up that physicality and some of that, quote unquote softness that Texas was often criticized for. I think a lot of that's moved away. The next level of that is play like Georgia.